before presenting the famous allegory of the cave in Republic Book 7, Socrates actually tells us explicitly what its purpose is. Its purpose is to illustrate the effects of education and the lack of it on us. Moreover, when he explains the allegory of the cave, he makes very explicit and crucial reference to the analogies of the sun and the line from Republic Book 6. So, sun, line, and cave go together in order to explain something, education and our relative position in the cosmos. You can't exactly take one of them and explain it all by itself. Nonetheless, I'm going to try to talk about the sun analogy in this video. Hopefully, as we cover the sun analogy, the line analogy, and the allegory of the cave in the videos to come, our journey will be one of increasing illumination. Hey everybody, I'm Dr. Bowers, these are office hours, and here are some study guide questions. Go! What is sight according to the sun analogy? What is the eye's analog in the sun analogy? What is sight's analog in the sun analogy? What are the analogues of visible objects in the sun analogy? What is the sun's analog in the sun analogy? What is understanding according to the sun analogy? How should we investigate the question of light's analog in the sun analogy? What must light's analog be based on a correct investigation into it? What must the good be based on a careful understanding of the sun analogy then? What is the good's metaphysical aspect in the sun analogy? And what is the ethical dimension of the sun analogy? As always, it may be worth writing these questions down and occasionally pausing the video to fill out the answers. The sun analogy begins to creep into the text around 507, 508, and it continues up past 511. We're going to focus on this crucial part here at 508c. Let's say, then, that this is what I call the offspring of the good, which the good begot as its analog. What the latter is in the intelligible realm in relation to understanding and intelligible things, the former is in the visible realm in relation to sight and visible things. So, the basic analogy is this, that the sun is related to what is visible in the same way that the form of the good, or goodness itself, is related to what is understandable, or intelligible, as we have here. What does that mean? Well, let's consider the phenomenon of sight, or seeing. If we pursue the sun analogy, sight occurs when the eye is focused on a visible object in the presence of the sun, because the sun is a source of light. Now, in the sun analogy, the eye is likened to the mind. The way that we access the visible realm with our eyes is likened to us accessing a realm of intelligible objects with our minds, as though our intellect was a kind of sixth sense and its objects of perception were these purely rational beings. And in the same way that the eye focuses on visible objects when sight occurs, so must the mind focus on, well, intelligible objects or understandable objects. What are those? Well, they're definitions, arguments, equations, laws, principles, things that you study by doing this. Right? There are certain sorts of affairs, certain topics, where you don't study by looking really hard. And you don't study by gathering lots and lots of different evidence or opinions from the world. You study it by focusing your mind. I mean, this is very, very simple. I'm glossing over a lot of important details, but remember, we're just sort of taking an introductory approach to this text, right? The intelligible objects that the mind is focused on when understanding occurs are things like equations, propositions, definitions. They're going to include Platonic forms, but as Plato's theory of the forms was expanded over later centuries, it became clear that the forms were not the only intelligible objects. Nonetheless, that's what intelligible objects are if we pursue the sun analogy. That's the analog of visible objects. Now, of course, the analog of the sun is goodness, or the form of the good, or the good itself, ta kalon kathauto, as it is in the original Greek. So let's fill in the sun analogy this way. In the same way that sight occurs when the eye is focused on a visible object in the presence of the sun because the sun sheds light, so does understanding or knowledge, so does understanding occur when the mind is focused on an intelligible object in the presence of the good. Because the good sheds... It seems as though we're missing just a crucial piece of this analogy. In order to really understand what the good is, according to Plato, we need to focus, we need to zoom in on what light's analog is supposed to be. What is it that goodness sheds that allows for understanding equations and definitions and things? That's what we're going to have to ask. Now, to correctly investigate the question of light's analog, there are three passages that we want to look at. The first is 510b5, which is elaborated up through around 511. Let's take a look at that. Here, Socrates is talking about mathematicians who study the intelligible objects. He says, "You will understand it more easily after this explanation. I think you know that students of geometry, calculation, and the like hypothesize the odd and the even, the various figures, the three kinds of angles, and the other things akin to these in each of their investigations, regarding them as known. These they treat as hypotheses and do not think it necessary to give any argument for them, either to themselves or to others, as if they were evident to everyone. And going from these first principles through remaining steps, they arrive in full agreement at the point they set out to reach in their investigation." So, people who study intelligible objects, they study things like the odd and the even, the various kinds of angles, mathematical objects. Socrates is noting that mathematicians and people who study those objects, they treat those objects as hypotheses, and they do not give arguments for them. What does he mean by that exactly? He can't mean that they don't give definitions of them. Mathematicians do and did give definitions for their mathematical concepts. Euclid had not yet written his Elements, but he soon would, and the mathematics of the time did consist in axiomatic definitions. So what is he exactly critiquing here? One way that you could prove something is you could derive it from more basic principles, That would be one way to no longer treat something as a hypothesis, is to derive it from first, more basic principles. But mathematicians can't do that, because by Socrates' own admission, the various angles, the odd and the even, and other mathematical posits, those are first principles. They are rock bottom. You can't derive them from more basic things. So, how can they be rendered unhypothetical? How can they be legitimately argued for if not derived from something more basic? This is a puzzle. As we solve this puzzle, it will unlock our understanding of what light's analog truly is in the sun analogy. Next, let's look at 437a5. In that part of Book 4, Socrates and Glaucon are discussing whether a single object can have opposite features at the same time. They're considering potential counterexamples and refuting each one. What about a man who's standing still and moving his arms? Well, he doesn't have opposite incompatible features at the same time. Different parts of him have those features. What about this? What about that? Socrates says, in order to avoid going through all these objections one by one and taking a long time to prove them all untrue, let's hypothesize that what we have said is correct and carry on. We have a clue here. It looks like one way that you might prove something, besides deriving it from more basic first principles, is by refuting all the objections. So that must be what mathematicians are failing to do, according to Socrates. It's not that they don't provide any account of what the various angles are, or that they don't define odd and even and parallel in these terms. No, it's more that they don't defend those principles from certain types of objections. Let's look at 534c. When describing what it would take to really have knowledge of the good, Socrates claims, unless someone can give an account of the form of the good, distinguishing it from everything else, and can survive all examination as if in a battle, striving to examine things not in accordance with belief, but in accordance with being, and can journey through all that with his account still intact, you will say that he does not know the good itself, or any other good whatsoever. So, it looks like one way to prove something is to refute all the various objections which one might raise in a sort of philosophical discussion about it. At 511b5, Socrates describes how one might use the good or appeal to the good in order to refute all those objections to intelligible objects, thereby rendering them unhypothetical. He claims, I mean what reason itself grasps by the power of dialectical discussion, treating its hypotheses not as first principles, but as genuine hypotheses, that is, stepping stones and links in a chain, in order to arrive at what is unhypothetical and the first principle of everything. What we should importantly focus on is the mention of dialectical discussion. Dialectic is that craft or that science that uses the form of the good, or that appeals to the form of the good in its workings. What is dialectic? Well, it's elenchus. It's the way that Socrates examined his interlocutors, but turned into a principled craft rather than just a thing Socrates does as a habit. It's elenchus turned into a science. It's Socrates' art of questioning made into a robust field of inquiry. It's philosophy as Plato knows it. So based on all this, let's get back to the sun analogy. Understanding occurs when the mind is focused on an equation or a definition, when the mind is focused on an intelligible object in the presence of the good, because the good sheds something that makes that understanding possible. Based on everything we've looked at, we should say this, that light's analog, the thing that facilitates understanding in the way that light facilitates sight, must be logical order or logical structure. Something like logical structure, right? When you take a visible object and you expose it to the light, you are able to access its visible structure more easily, its colors, its texture, the subtlety of its shape better. And likewise, when you take an equation or a definition and you expose it to logical structure, you define its terms, you draw distinctions, you perform elenchus-like investigation on it. You do to it what Socrates does to concepts he asks people about in the Piraeus. And by doing that, by exposing it to logic, you come to understand its intellectual structure in the same way that you come to understand a colored object's visible structure by exposing it to the light. So, light's analog in the sun analogy must be something like logical order or logical structure. And by extension, the sun's analog, goodness itself, must be something like a paradigm of logical structure, which is pure logical structure and nothing else, and a source of all other logical structure, in the same way that the sun seems to be pure light and nothing else, a paradigm of light, a source of light everywhere else. Well, what would that be? According to Plato's followers, the form of the good is something like oneness or unity or identity or some inexpressible logical foundational truth that underpins all intelligibility and all mathematical intelligibility in the world. It's the unhypothetical first principle of everything. Neoplatonists called it the One, ta hen. What is the metaphysical aspect of this? Well, there's a lot, and we're going to get into them as we proceed into the line analogy and the cave allegory. But here we can see a kind of ontological rationalism. For Plato, there's this analogy here. At 509b5, Socrates says, "You should also say that not only do the objects of knowledge owe their being known to the good, but their existence and being are also due to it. Although the good is not being, but something yet beyond being, superior to it in rank and power." That second bit of that passage is incredibly controversial, influential, and intriguing, but let's just look at that first part for a second. In the same way that the sun causes things in the visible world to grow and to generate, so, according to the sun analogy, does the form of the good cause things to be what they are. More specifically, the form of the good causes intelligible objects to be what they are, for definitions to remain the same and true, and for equations to remain the same and true, like 2 plus 2 remaining in existence and always equaling 4, and that being a mathematical law. That subsistence of principle is caused by or sustained by the form of the good, in the same way that an ecosystem is sustained by the sun. And although that may sound fantastical, you might think about the foundations of mathematics, and the idea that there are certain principles of unity or identity that might underlie all mathematical science, and by extension, all of reality. And here again, we get this ontological rationalism. For Plato, nothing can exist at all unless it has some minimal degree of logical structure or logical order. To be at all is to be structured to some degree. We're saying an awful lot about the good, and so far practically nothing ethical has come into this discussion. Let's fix that and note that here's why value is a piece of this picture for Plato. According to Plato, what something's good is, what is good for something, is for it to have a certain kind of structure. What's good for a cat, for instance, is for the cat to have a certain kind of cat structure, a certain proportion of cat nutrients and cat tissue, and a certain kind of cat dynamics in its workings. That's what we would call cat health. The health of a cat is a certain kind of structure, and that is the cat's good. It's the form of the cat, as a matter of fact. The form of the cat is going to be something like that ideal structure of its health, towards which every cat strives and tries to grow. And likewise for all other living things. What's good for a fern is for it to achieve some ideal fern structure, and the more it achieves that structure, the better off the fern is, and what is good for a tree, and so forth. It's important to remember that the legitimate extension of this philosophy to human beings proceed within the constraints of what is socially correct, and not amount to marginalizing groups that are already oppressed or bolstering old chauvinisms. So, what's good for a living thing is for it to achieve a certain kind of order. And likewise, what's bad for that kind of thing, and Plato explains this at length in Book 10, is for it to fail to achieve that order. An injury or a sickness is a disruption in the order which constitutes the body's good. So, we've said a little bit about the sun analogy. It's pretty exciting, isn't it? There's a lot that we can say about it, a lot more, and hopefully we will. Here, I'd like to pause and just give a sort of update on this channel. This is a very distressing time to endure, a lot of uncertainty. I hope everyone is being safe and being responsible. I aim to continue uploading content to this channel. Originally, this is a fun hobby. Then it became a way to deliver content to my students during quarantine. Now I guess it's sort of a vector sum of those two things. And I'll try to continue uploading content. I may also diversify this channel's content and also include some other things besides philosophy. In any case, thank you very, very much for watching. I am very appreciative of everyone who stops to watch these videos all the way through and to take notes and to, think about all this. Please do stay safe. Thanks. Goodbye.